Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be taking a long-form deep dive into political marketing and digital strategy around the 2020 Andrew Yang campaign. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Andrew Yang, he was a complete political outsider who broke in as a major Democratic contender for the 2020 U.S. election. He didn't poll much higher than 4%, but he did qualify for the majority of Democratic Party debates, so sharing the stage with leading figures like Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And Yang's platform was very much around what to do with the increasing trend towards automation and people losing jobs, where one of his key policy proposals was providing universal basic income, or UBI, a $1,000 check to every American every month. So kind of a radical policy proposal, but did find resonance with a niche online audience. So my guest today is Andrew Frawley. He is the former director of marketing at Yang 2020 and was there for the beginning of the campaign and was working on things like establishing social media accounts, which, as we'll discuss, was difficult because a lot of the key usernames were already taken. We'll also talk about the role of podcasts in political campaigns, which is interesting because Andrew Yang really had his breakout moments through podcasts such as Sam Harris and later with Joe Rogan. And I think overall, what we're talking about here is how to use digital strategy. What are some of the challenges when you don't have a large name recognition, brand recognition, or credibility? And in that case, what are these social media platforms useful for? And I think from Andrew's perspective, it's more about using the online communities like Facebook groups and Reddit groups rather than the more mainstream social media channels. So overall, I think this episode is really interesting because it follows very nicely from our previous episode, which was more about the playbook for running a modern political campaign, whereas Andrew's experience is much more focusing on an outsider campaign that was much less formal and kind of learning as they went along. And so you can visit his website that I'll link to in the episode description, where he has a bunch of posts about particular experiences from the campaign, which are very funny. Things like getting Andrew Yang to make a prettier signature because his original signature was not looking professional, or what do you do when you have an Instagram account with only a few hundred followers and you're running for national office? It doesn't look good, right? So we'll get into all of these things, but check out his website and the posts there if you want to get a deeper dive into the campaign. So again, I think it's interesting to follow from the last episode with a kind of story of how this campaign unfolded and some of the challenges and successes that came along with it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Andrew Frawley. Again, he is the former director of marketing for Yang 2020. Andrew, thanks for taking the time out. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics Podcast.
Hi, Michael. Happy to be here.
So Andrew Yang's 2020 campaign is so interesting because he was truly an outsider candidate without any prior political experience, yet he managed to break through as a legitimate contender for the Democratic nomination. So first off, how did you end up getting involved with politics in the first place, and the Yang campaign specifically?
Yeah. So, it's like a very twisting story, and it really just depends on where you want to begin the timeline. But for the shortened podcast version, I was in college at some point, and I wanted to get into startups. I wanted to, at some point in my junior year, I just was like, okay, what am I going to do with my life? And I was like, I'm going to change the world, because that's what directionless young people want to do. They don't know why, but they just want to change the world. I wanted to do that in startups, specifically with the brain, human potential, neurotechnology. But I was like a lackluster student at Virginia Commonwealth University, which isn't like a super, I don't know, you don't graduate from there and people are fawning over you. And so I had a 3.0 marketing degree, and I'm like, I'm going to go do neuroscience. So nobody would hire me in neuroscience. So I drove my car to San Francisco. I had no job, no house, and nobody would give me a house because I had no job. So I ended up living in a hacker house, which is where the story really starts to trend towards Yang. I'm living in the hacker house, which had about 50 entrepreneurs, techie people in it. And then there was me who didn't get a job in neuroscience, got a job at a random software startup running the marketing team of one, 10 people, whatever. While I'm there, I have this big existential crisis. I started asking myself, like, what is, like a true existential crisis? I'm just like 9-month depression, just real sad. So while I'm there, I start caring more and more about like human welfare and well-being and things like that, rather than just like making us some like super optimized, cyborgs. At the same time, I have all these roommates who are working in artificial intelligence, and they're like, yeah, it's going to take over the world. It's going to take all the jobs. And I was like, well, before any of that happens, like once it does take the jobs, that's going to be really bad for just people. Like people are going to be depressed. Work is a great source of meaning and purpose. So I, having this existential crisis about mental health, and then I see this, I get really jazzed up about the future of labor, and I start just like spending all of my free time like reading economics books and government books about like what is the big solution to the world's big problems, at least from a technological standpoint. At some point in 2017, in June, I'm visiting New York City and I meet Andrew Yang, and this was like a interesting moment for me because I'd actually applied to his program Venture for America in college and got denied when I was trying to become an entrepreneurial guy. But I meet him randomly, and he's talking about how he's going to leave Venture for America soon. And he has some big project coming up. He's talking all about robots and AI and the future of work. And I'm doing the same, obviously. I show him my textbooks. I talk to him about how much I'm freaking out about this. And he's basically just like, I'm going to run for president. So if you're into that, you should join. And I'm like, what? I mean, it's just obviously a really strange thing to hear from somebody, especially somebody who like at the time was like totally like unknown and irrelevant. But I grew up hating politics actually because I grew up in DC, and I don't know, there's something about that region. You would think people would love politics. They actually don't. Like most people work in government and they actually detest it. It's truly how it is. It took me 3 months to decide. I did a whole country tour. I just went to universities talking to like professors and stuff, what I should do with my life. And I ultimately decided to join. Yang tells me I'm going to like join as like a marketing lead. I end up being the second person on the staff, joining in December 2017 in his mother's apartment, me, him, and one other person. And we launched the campaign out of there. For the first 5 months, it was just us. And yeah, it's sort of how things got going.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our last episode, we were talking about the kind of modern political campaign and all the steps that go into running. On your website, you detail this kind of process and your experiences on the campaign, and it seems that it was much more informal than what we talked about last episode. And one of those things was about having a campaign plan, like this document that outlines, previous turnout results, the earned media strategy, the paid media strategy. Did you have a sort of campaign plan, or was it much more kind of informal?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely informal. I don't think anyone would expect us to really approach this formally. I mean, the loose idea early on was like, in December 2017, Yang's announcing for president. That's like an election, 3 years away. So obviously the approach was very sort of like startup, which is like, and it's similar in the investing world, which is like time in the market is better than timing the market. So sort of just jump in there and just start talking to people and just sort of just see how it goes. And then obviously sort of like learn in public, which is like a big theme in marketing as well. Learn in public and just sort of be honest, like, we're out here campaigning, we have a message, we're listening to people. It's very reactive and incorporating what people say and what we learn and, whatever. Besides announcing early, the plan was like, we had an idea of our early audiences, which was Asian Americans, UBI supporters, tech people, and young people, all of whom are sort of feel like outsiders in the current political system.
Right. And it's interesting, this, Yang's role as an outsider, I think, is particularly important. And you discussed that on your website, where you mentioned that the campaign's overarching approach was essentially to run like a startup, which you kind of alluded to just a second ago. But can you outline what that startup mentality entails for a political campaign and how it's related to the candidate's credibility or outsider status?
Yeah. The interesting thing is, like, when I look back, I don't think we like intentionally were like, hey, we're going to run this like a startup. It was just sort of like, those were the things that made sense because our task was so similar to what a startup does. Like, if it made sense strategically to do the things that normal political campaigns did early on, then I think we would have done that. It's doing whatever seems to have the most likely chance of success. I think you can see that in Yang's mayoral race, which was not a success, unfortunately. But they ran like a pretty traditional campaign, like hired very traditional political consultants. For us, it was very much like, I mean, I think the best way to think about this is something I've sort of written about, which is that I've come to realize that like the heart and soul of like, political blood is your credibility. And for Yang at the time, he had obviously like none of that. Like, he had no name ID, so you have like nothing going on there. And then you have no credibility from being like a politician. And then there was no like cross sector credibility really going on in a major way. Like, Donald Trump comes in and he's just like a rich, famous guy. And so it's like, wow, that's not the credibility that's actually going to really help you with governing in like polls and just awareness. It's credibility. Yang was coming over with like 3,500 Twitter followers and a few random awards from the White House that like nobody cares about really. And so he had no credibility. And this is looking back, the way that projected out through the campaign is like you can't do anything when you have no credibility. And on the campaign, I came to realize there were sort of like four main wings or options of media and marketing that we had. And you're very limited if you have no credibility. So let's say the first one is legacy media. So you're like CNN and stuff. If you have no credibility, they just like don't care about you. So you're just irrelevant. They don't talk about you. Your second one is ads. And I mean, if you have no credibility, you also probably don't have money, because money, unfortunately, is like, super correlated with credibility in our society. But even if you do have money, but you don't have credibility, which one example is John Delaney in 2020. I mean, that guy spent like $200 million or something. Maybe it was a little less. I mean, absurd amount of money. And like, I don't think even got close to breaking 1%. So what happens when you have money and no credibility is you just spend the ads, and then people look at the ads and they're like, who the hell is this guy? I mean, you could look at it as Sean Donovan in the New York City mayoral race. I mean, his dad, gave him like $10 million and got 2%. I mean, so then your legacy media, not an option. Ads, not an option. So then you have to start getting creative, because those are really your like most traditional routes as far as like quick growth. Of course, like obviously you can go out and like, ground and pound it and stuff, which is a whole separate thing that I'm not going to get into at this moment. But so let's say you start thinking about like, okay, how can you get like fast growth? And you start looking at like stunts and things, which we did plenty of on the 2020 campaign and did pretty much nothing for us. I mean, got some media, but never actually brought you the value that you need to win an election. Like, Yang goes on a debate stage in 2019, promises money to the country, and the big giveaway that we did. And, like literally everyone that signed up just like unsubscribed like 2 weeks later. And so it was literally just like useless. I mean, you can always see this in the numbers with social media. It's like, let's say your web traffic is like 50,000 a week, and then it goes up to like 1 million when you do something like that, which it did. And then like literally like the week after is like 50,000. I mean, it's just not even like 55. It's like 50 straight back exactly to where you were. So then you get to your sort of like last major option, which is like social media, alternative media, which I sort of view as like one bundle. And I know we're probably going to get into a lot of that, so I won't totally unpack that. But that is where your sort of like only options really materialize. And even that world is getting very saturated, because you have a lot of like people like Gary Vaynerchuk. If this audience is familiar with that guy, I mean, he's taught like a whole generation to just like bombard any new media platform. You sort of see this with Clubhouse. It became just like the most self-promotional thing that's probably happened in the last 30 years, because you have this entire generation that's just like trained to like bombard anything new. So how all of this relates specifically to, the sort of startup mentality. So we have no credibility. You can't do anything. So that's like, we didn't actually consciously realize all of these things I just mentioned, but we did actually know that we needed credibility, but we weren't even using that term. We were just like, okay, what are we doing? And so from a startup standpoint, it was first, you're trying to break into a new market. So how do you do that? You start thinking about the product adoption curve, if people are familiar with that. And like the very tip of the product adoption curve is winning, your niche market or early innovators. And for us, the best way to do that was just being an exceptional product that completely owned one niche. Because if you think about in a startup, it's like, okay, well, the only way that you sort of get any little audience to like you is you represent the people who are basically completely unrepresented. And then you just totally represent them. You do it so well that they just love you so passionately because they've never seen someone like that. So for us, the attempt was trying to be like the facts, math, but also very human person, because a lot of people, outsiders, all these sort of audiences who aren't very active in politics, like when they look at politics, like what do they not feel like they see? They don't feel like, people are superhuman. They think, all politicians sound the same. That's like what people feel, whether it's true or not. Not making any assessments, but that's what people feel. And then they also feel like, people don't talk straight to them. And, you could unpack that whole specific topic for a whole podcast in itself. But so that was sort of like what we were leaning into. And that's also sort of who Yang actually is. Like, it wasn't like a super calculated thing. If you look at who he is in the media, a smart, generally, well, this is what I think, of course, but like a smart, generally empathetic and pretty human person who says things that come off as mistakes because he's not actually like over calculating every answer. I mean, that's up to voters, of course, to determine if that's like a good thing. But that's sort of like what the attempt was. And I could unpack that further, but I know you have specific questions.
Definitely. I want to dig into the social media side because, okay, obviously, Yang definitely comes across as this authentic candidate. You're looking at, as you said, the access to legacy media isn't so great because of a lack of credibility, and spending money on ads may not necessarily work if you don't have credibility. So turning to social media, you describe how there were some challenges in just setting up the accounts because key usernames like Andrew Yang and Yang 2020 were already taken because Yang is quite a popular surname in Korea. So let's start there. Can you walk us through some of the challenges in setting up Yang social media accounts and kind of how you overcame them in those early stages of the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, getting the username thing was pretty funny because like I was coming straight out of Silicon Valley, and when we started the campaign, I like just turned 24. So I was still very idealistic about what one person can do. And out there, I'd been a part of a community that was like growth hackers and stuff, where just, it has this mentality of just, I mean, it's also a buzzword a bit, but it's a general mentality of like, you're going to get the job done, the marketing KPIs, you're going to crush it no matter what. And so I'm trying to set up these usernames, and, I'm just not taking no for an answer. And so I'm just like hunting these people down on social media and, all these things, just trying to get their usernames or like contact them. And most of them are just dormant accounts, which is the hardest part. It's not even like active people where you can like try and negotiate. I mean, it's just like a dead account that hasn't been logged into for 8 years. So I had to make a concession, and we started the campaign with his usernames being Andrew Yang 2020. And that was like an ego check. I was like, gosh, I can't even get usernames. And then the task became getting followers because his Instagram had 300, his Twitter had 3,500, and I had to start the Facebook. And like when you want to talk about lacking credibility, I mean, there's just nothing as bad as saying you're running for president and then having like 300 Instagram followers. And so that was like one of my major goals in 2018, which is, how can I get just this guy more followers, just so we just don't look completely like embarrassing. And I think everyone agreed with that. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's like, does your follower count matter? I mean, it's like an existential question. I think everyone in society asks about themselves. Does this really like have any weight on like who I am? But it's just one of those things where we know, like, you have those sort of subconscious judgments that are made within society. I mean, you look at someone running for president and you're like, dude, my 10-year-old cousin has more followers than this guy. So the ways we tried to do that were like on Instagram, the way we got to 1,000. I mean, it was just like slow rolling, but we got to 1,000 by me basically plugging in my phone's contacts. You can like sync your phone's contacts to Instagram. At least you could in 2018. And then Instagram would like allow you to follow all of those people. And my thesis was like, okay, well, these people have like greater exposure to Yang than, random people. So I just started doing that. And then I would unfollow them after they follow them. And that actually got us to 1,000. But grueling stuff over like the course of a month and a half. And Facebook, it was pretty similar, where it was just like I was creating videos for our like 15 fans that we had on like how to invite their friends to like the page. I was doing things like that. Like I was logging into Yang's Facebook account and like inviting his friends, messaging his friends, hey, can you like this for us? I mean, when you think about running for president and those are your origins, it's very humbling. So that was how we sort of tackled that problem in a small way. That the big lesson that I learned on all of that was that you're obviously not going to win an election doing that, though. You start questioning a lot how you're spending your time.
Right, but I mean, I think you're you're on point that of course it's important that you have over 300 followers if you're trying to be taken seriously as a presidential candidate. That's just kind of the way things are these days. So I could definitely understand the grind of getting from 300 to 1,000 with messaging people or syncing contacts. But I mean, eventually you got to over 500,000 followers on Twitter, something like 500,000 on Instagram, and had a vibrant Reddit community of over 100,000 users. So how did you make the jump from those early origins to these larger numbers? What was the kind of growth strategy there?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we launched, it was like a very humbling experience. And we had estimated, I can't remember if it was the first week or first month, but we estimated at some window of time after we launched that we would raise, we took like internal bets. I mean, we didn't bet money on it, but we just bet, how much do we think we're going to raise after we announce we're president? And we estimated, I don't know, like $300,000. And we barely hit that in the first year. I mean, it was just like so far off. So 2018 was just like this gradual learning experience of like trying all sorts of things and like none of it working. So for me, I came out of the gates, guns blazing, thinking I was going to do some big thing and like pop it open, because the way I looked at it was that I thought Yang was like a very exceptional product, and all I had to do was get him a little bit of exposure, and then it would just sort of be a flywheel. And one of the humbling things was realizing how much media it actually takes to do that sort of thing on a national scale, because we come out of the gates and we're fighting for press pieces. We get them on, I think, like one thing on Now This, and then CNBC wrote a good article about him that went viral to like hundreds of thousands of shares. This guy wants to give away free money, and then goes on Reddit, gets on the front page, and I'm like, okay, this is great. In any other instance, it's like a breakout moment for a brand. But none of those things had any staying value for us. I started trying to get really crafty. I've read the book by Ryan Holiday, of course. And so I was doing all sorts of creative things, trying to trade up the chain for media. And, I was doing all the little things you're supposed to do on social media. I mean, every single little optimization. I was working way too many hours. I was putting out, this whole different hierarchy of content, optimizing for like the story, then optimizing for content that was shareable, little videos, quips, Yang taking people down, putting the headline up there, optimizing like the frame, getting people in it, smiling, all the things that you're supposed to do on social media. And pretty much through all of 2018, we were still growing at like 50 followers a week. I mean, it was just the biggest hit on my ego ever, where my assessment is I have this great product, and once that product gets to people, it will grow really fast. And nothing was growing very fast. So I was like, okay, I'm obviously not getting it to people, and I'm doing everything. I'm pulling out every weapon I have. So ultimately what happened was Yang goes on Sam Harris's podcast in June or something of 2018, who is a cognitive neuroscientist, philosopher, meditation guru, all sorts of things that guy is. And that was like a mini breakout moment where Yang goes on a podcast and it hits a niche audience. They like him and we get a little boost. And then all of our numbers were finally higher for a little bit. Now, two things were happening before that podcast. One, I had already been sort of strategizing on alternative media. So I had already compiled like this big list of media outlets and podcasts that I was going to try and outreach to, because nothing was working. So I was like, this is my last Hail Mary. Like, I'm going to get him on some podcasts and this is going to break us out. The podcast with Sam Harris was like the sort of validator internally, where Yang and Zach were like, okay, maybe podcasts are a good option for us. So I got this green light to do a bunch of outreach to podcasts, and it train wrecked and got us on nothing. Long story short, the second thing that I had done was, because I was realizing nothing I was doing had any impact, my whole strategy, and most of like, at least for me within social media and marketing, my whole strategy had shifted from try and grow him incrementally, try and help, with the breakout. My approach was basically to just optimize for the big moment. And so the way this looked was trying to get him on the big podcast, things like that. But what I was doing besides this outreach, very specific to podcast and alternative media, was trying to gather the small audience we had into a small place so that you could organize them, build a culture, and then use that group to go around online and like make a lot of racket. And so ultimately what that looked like was, I just launched our Facebook group before the Sam Harris podcast. Sam Harris podcast comes out. So when that hit, I sent everybody who went to our websites and social media and all of our various marketing funnels, the bottom of the funnel, rather than being donate or whatever else, was funneling everyone into our Reddit or our Facebook group, where I was working with a few admins to basically organize and sort of set a culture. Something I've started to talk about, which is like the sort of house party analogy, which is if you're running for office and you have no credibility and you think about it like you're throwing a house party, having no credibility is the equivalent of having a party and there's nobody in it. Like people show up at the door and they're like, this is suspicious. You're running for, Congress, or you're trying to throw this party, but there's nobody in there. You have no supporters. Like something must be wrong. It must not be good. So if you think about it, like the first few people who take a chance and come into your party. So for us, that was really the Sam Harris moment, which was people finally showed up to the party and we funneled them into the Facebook groups, which the house party analogy is like keeping them in the same area of the house. You have a big empty house and everyone's just wandering around the house. They're not having a good time. They're separated. They're far apart. They don't know if there's anyone else even in the house. And so if you compare it, it's like get everyone to one room, the living room, the kitchen. And for us, it was get everyone into the Facebook, get everyone into the Reddit, and then entertain them. And you can set the culture. So the same thing with the house party, you can bring out hors d'oeuvres and like champagne and make it classy, or you can just like have a bunch of tequila and shot bottles or whatever. You, the host, really get to determine how it goes. And that will obviously determine if you matched your people right, if they will stay and invite their friends. And as long as they're having a good time, small environments are totally still a good time for a party. Like you don't have to be in a giant club to have a good time. You can have great fun with 7 people in your living room if you're all in sync. So that was sort of the idea, of course, not consciously at the time, but gathering everyone in the Facebook, Reddit, setting the culture. And that was just like, hey, this media outlet left Yang off their list. Hey, let's reach out and let them know. And so it was very much early on setting the culture. And then after the successes between that and the Sam Harris podcast, the whole obsession of the campaign became for about 7 months just trying to get on Joe Rogan because that was the biggest podcast out there. So that was sort of the strategy shift there in the end.
Yeah, interesting. I wanted to ask a bunch of follow-up questions here, but I wanted to ask you about particularly Reddit, and I suppose Facebook groups as well, if they're serving similar functions. Because we talked on a previous podcast about how Reddit was like a key organizing hub for the Buttigieg campaign as well, who was also quite an outsider who became successful over the course of the campaign. So what are the kind of key differences there between your mainstream like Facebook or Instagram posts versus those online communities where you can kind of set the culture and the tone? How do those, or what role do those kind of communities play for the Yang campaign?
Yeah, it's interesting because the way I look at it is that I think Facebook is gradually dying. So nobody really goes on there except for, I guess, the groups at this point. But I don't know. I don't have a great pulse on Facebook in the middle of 2021, but I know when we were going through the presidential campaign, it was really mostly a useless platform besides the Facebook group. But at least when we were getting started, I viewed Facebook as a much more effective place to set the culture than Reddit because you have a lot more control. And I think control is super important in making sure you can establish a culture. Like the Facebook group is where a lot of the heart and soul of our online organizing originated. It was much more active, and I would make it so by just one, personally being in there, posting every day. And then I would also have Yang jump in there all the time. Sometimes, he would get on his Facebook account. He would do live streams, creating that entire incentive system for people to enjoy the Facebook group much more than anywhere else. And then additionally, it's also because you have a lot more control on Facebook of the group, where Reddit is more distributed. You have, let's say, like 8 mods, and they sort of collectively set the rules and stuff. Like I'd made the group, and I just like was like the self-appointed president of this group, or you could say like, I don't want to use a different term there, because by doing that, some things that I did, like in Silicon Valley, Facebook groups were all the rage, at least in 2017. But I had also seen how they failed, and they often failed by essentially just letting conversation get totally random, off topic, and let people make really bad posts. So the most important thing was just policing that people actually made good posts. I mean, comment sections, like whatever, people can chat about whatever they want. But when you go to a group and it's filled with like the worst, like one of the things that we very explicitly banned and did not allow was posting a link to an article or anything and not having a comment. You see that in all the time on Facebook groups is someone will just put up an article and then just have no comment. We were like, you have to make, our line in the sand was that you have to make like an actual contribution beyond just the article. You can't just like say like, here's this article. You have to be like thoughtful and like share why you're sharing this. And so that was very effective. And so it made the group actually valuable rather than just being filling everyone's timeline as like a junk distributor. I will say though, as time went on, that culture just spread to Reddit and Twitter and all the other places the Yang Gang lived. And at that point, the Facebook group became much less important. Like if you look at Yang now, like the Facebook group is pretty much completely an afterthought, and the Reddit is much more of the heart and soul. I think really the clear distinction is like getting started versus maintaining. Yeah, I would say that's probably the distinction between those, between Facebook and Reddit specifically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember hearing the CEO of Flickr, I think it was, talking about how setting those norms in the beginning is so crucial for the development of a platform. And I think her example was something with whether bikini pictures should be allowed because that offends, some cultures, and they decided they would allow it, and that set the tone later for the type of content on the platform. So I'm curious to hear how you actually moderated that Facebook group. I mean, we've talked before on the show about how, Facebook doesn't give the best, automated moderation filters for comments, for example. So was it that you were just manually going in and removing articles that didn't provide a contribution, or how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, what we did in there was like very elaborate. First we made it so that, if anyone was making a post, it had to get approval. So posts had to be approved before they actually entered the group. And then, we had a bunch of volunteers who I'd worked with since very early in 2018. And then, they wanted to help more and more. And so I invited them to help me moderate. At first, it was me doing it. And then that just became overwhelming even before we blew up. And then I invited a few people to help me moderate it. And then it just sort of became like I don't want to say like a pyramid scheme, but that's sort of like the idea. Like I had training videos for the moderators that I'd made personally. Obviously in 2018, it was just me managing myself. By the end of the campaign, our marketing team was like 20 or 25 people. So I was like totally detached from the Facebook group by the end of the campaign. Like there were 2 or 3 people between me and the people who I used to manage. But they were still watching the videos that I'd made in 2018 on like what the appropriate etiquette was and things like that, like what our principles were, what the purpose of the group was. It's every principle of marketing just applied specifically to a Facebook group. Like we named it the Yang 2020 Base Camp. And, the sort of subtle message to that was like, this is the base camp where we like organize ourselves, we get our gear or whatever it is, and then we go out into the world and we do things, which was campaigning for Yang. And really the post thing is like 90% of the battle. If you can just keep the junk off the timeline, then you actually have valuable things in there. Early on, I had a schedule for myself with posting, which is like, every Monday I would do this, and then it had to be very personal. So I actually like talked with people all the time in the comments early on. It's just a sort of exhausting stuff. I mean, but that's politics because, as they say, like politics is local, but even online. And then the way we continue to set the culture is like, I have a few things that I had like printed out and have in this like list of notes that I had taken on the campaign, which was on December 14th, I made a post outlined outreach, distribution, and creation. And I made that post on Andrew Yang's Facebook account. And it was like the 3 tenets of what it meant to be in the base camp: outreach, distribution, and creation, which was 1, outreach is like, hey, help us reach out to journalists. Distribution was anything you see about Andrew Yang online, like it. That helps the algorithms. Comment. That's the highest value thing you can do. Share it to help it spread. If you hear he's going on YouTube, watch it, like it, comment, do all these things. This was in 2018, pushing this into the community. And I was using this with Yang's account. And then the last one, creation, was like make memes basically. And then I would supply the group with like funny pictures of Yang that I had taken when I was our photographer. It's like him looking goofy. And I'm like, here, like use this for your memes, like, just funneling things. So it's just like feeding them, giving direction. No, that was pretty much it. Once you sort of get that culture going, as I used to say, is like the second stage of it is like weaponizing it. So that was like 2018, once Yang had like blown up after Joe Rogan, and that small audience was already propagating the culture on its own. So Yang blows up. We go from raising $20,000 a month to $1 million a month in spring of 2019. And I go from being a team of 1 to a team of like 10 in 2 months or something. And then what ends up happening is that I found that your more traditional social media channels we use to basically direct the army publicly. So, before I was like in the Facebook group being like, hey guys, like, let's share this message. Like, if you look back at our social media in 2019, we were just putting it out wide open in, the world. Like our Instagram would be like, hey, the debate is coming up. Do these 4 online activities, like share our posts, message journalists. We were just putting it right out there because after my experiences in 2018, where I couldn't grow our social media at all, what was very validating was Yang blows up at some point, and then I'm using our social media and all these weapons to blow up as he did online in 2019. And so I came to realize I was like, okay, that's just the natural pain and pressure and struggle of trying to break out as a nobody. I'm not a terrible marketer. That's what it takes to break out. I'm clearly succeeding now. But the distinct lesson was that a lot of your more traditional social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, I realized were just never conducive to growth. At no point did we really ever grow on them at all. They're more like online websites or like more public websites. And so we started to use those channels basically just to direct the message and direct the audience. It wasn't even necessarily like, oh, let's put out some content on Instagram that's going to spread and go viral. I was just like, no, like that's not going to happen. It's a waste of time and effort. It was strictly what we've been doing in the Facebook group. It was just another level of like, okay, let's organize our people just at the biggest, most mass scale that we can.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think you can't discuss Andrew Yang's 2020 run without talking about podcasts. And it seems clear that, the first big kind of bump, as you mentioned, was going on Sam Harris's podcast, and then a real breakout moment going on Joe Rogan. And at least personally, I heard Andrew Yang's platform on a podcast. I don't remember exactly which one it was. So let's talk about that and the campaign's approach to podcasts. Was the going on or the attempt to go on a wide kind of circuit of podcasts a response to not getting that mainstream media coverage?
It was probably a response. He was a natural fit for podcasts very early on before we even really began utilizing podcasts. And I recognized this in 2018, and I think others on the team did as well, which was we're trying to present a candidate who is, the essence we're trying to present him on is like humanity and like the nuance of data, basically, and policy, which is obviously just best done on these platforms because they're long form. You actually get to see the soul of the person and the mind of the person. And then also it's like traditional media wasn't working for us. So we ended up there sort of out of necessity. We didn't really have any other options, but I think he would have ended up there anyways, especially because people on podcasts had never really felt they had a clear candidate that represented them just in general. Just blanket, it's like no candidate had really ever used podcasts in a major way. So yeah, it was a good fit. And then obviously once it did well and the media, just continued to not care about him, he went on probably every single podcast under the sun, and it was definitely very fruitful. I think podcasts now, though, for politics, it's very difficult. If you think about the 4 like options to just like break out as a small person in general in any industry, I think it's the toughest time to be in marketing probably in the last like 30 years because pretty much everyone is a small person. There's not many people who actually have like national credibility. So pretty much everyone has the same marketing problems. So legacy media doesn't care about you. Your ads, not that super effective unless you're, of course, just, if you're selling like lawnmowers, ads might work if you target it well. But for the most part, broadly, legacy media doesn't work, ads don't work, your stunts won't work. And then you have social media and your traditional social media like Instagram and Facebook and things like that, you're not going to grow on because they're just oversaturated. Like I have way too many friends from like high school and college who, they have great intentions and they're like, I'm going to start a fitness brand on YouTube. And then they just post YouTube videos. And I'm like, man, no one's going to discover you on there because those platforms you just drown in. You just drown in it. The only way you get discovered on there is by trending on there. Where you trend on there, is people find you somewhere else. So those platforms are out for growth. And so your only options are like true alternative media. And podcasts at this point are so big that you can't get on anything like in a major way unless you have something somewhat interesting. for me, I at least had like my Yang experience where, I end up in places like this. But if you're just like a small musician or something, or you're a small candidate, I think that's a whole separate discussion, whether or not the role of podcasts in local elections. I think that's a whole interesting topic. But just breaking out is so hard. And then again, with the Clubhouse thing, it's like anytime there's a new platform now, it just gets bombarded because you have this entire generation that knows they need to just bombard new platforms because that's where you see like generous creator algorithms. So I don't really know. It's a very tough time to be trying to break out in the media world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, thinking about podcasts as this like political medium, I think you're right in that it's interesting. We saw in 2020 campaigns starting their own podcast, right? Like the Bernie Sanders podcast or the Joe Biden podcast. And I mean, these were just complete flops as far as I know.
Yeah.
Whereas it really takes going on a established podcast, whether that's Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, Pod Save America, whatever it is. And in a sense, they become this alternative media outlet. But it's also interesting what you mentioned about the fit between Yang and, podcast being the right medium, because the kind of standard, campaign handbook is, use Facebook and Instagram because it will make your candidate more authentic if you do it right. Whereas you have a podcast, which has none of these visual components, but can very much serve to provide that authenticity to an audience.
Yeah, I think, and the tough thing is for political people is that Yang, coming as an outsider, not having a traditional message, didn't really politicize podcasts that much, in the sense that, he didn't go on Joe Rogan and people were like, why are you having, people were just like, who's this guy? He has some interesting things to say. It didn't really have like the negative effects of like taking a side or something. But then once you saw like Bernie Sanders go on there, and I forget who else Joe Rogan had on there. I mean, the conversations were fine, but people then just started saying things, I forget, Bernie Sanders just gets, ripped to shreds for going on, then all the politics starts coming into it. So I think it's very difficult for people to get into podcasts now because then Joe Rogan's like, I'm not having politicians on anymore. And, I think many other podcasts are probably going to do the same. The interesting thing is you mentioned those other campaigns started their own podcasts, and it's really funny because I fought the creation of our own podcast, the whole campaign. Yang Speaks was slated to be made in like 2018, and I just fought it to hell for the whole campaign because I had the clear understanding of how these media channels work, which was that nobody was going to listen to Yang Speaks who did not already like Yang. And so I was like, so we're just going to create a bunch of work for ourselves to talk to the people who we can already talk to across all these other channels. Nobody is like, hey, I'm going to go listen to this guy running for office. I'm going to go listen to his podcast, her podcast, their podcast. No one does that. Just nobody does that because people just don't trust candidates or even politicians to just give a honest take on things. That's what I think. That's my 2-second assessment right now. They go to like Freakonomics because they're like, hey, he's literally just talking about interesting things, or honestly here because you're just a guy exploring interesting things. Once a candidate has a podcast, they're like, oh, they obviously have this agenda, because that's just what most people think of politicians. Unfortunately, that's my take on the efficacy of individuals starting their own podcast.
Yeah, no, totally. I think the interesting part is how the spirit of the podcast, or what it generally covers, what the host asks, how does that interact with the candidate? I think there Yang is a great fit for Joe Rogan, but yeah, Bernie Sanders maybe not so much. So I totally agree. But I want to ask you about your quote unquote battle with Wikipedia, because this is an interesting sort of phenomenon where I think anyone who's tried to post something on Wikipedia will know that the editors are insanely active on monitoring that platform. And we know, there's been research on, during armed conflicts that you have, Russians editing versus Ukrainians editing, and they deploy bots to do this type of stuff and frame the narrative, which is really interesting. But you had some issues having the words major candidate to describe Yang on his Wikipedia page. So what was the story there, and why was it difficult, getting these edits to describe Yang as a major candidate?
Yeah, that was really funny. But I'm trying to think about when the problem began. Sometime in 2018, Wikipedia had this page called like the 2020 presidential candidates or something. It was just like a list of everyone who was running. And they organized it by party and then major candidates by party. And Yang was listed as just like other people. And, I took that very personally. And because the people he was next to were like a high school football coach, like Vermin Supreme. And I was just like, come on. I mean, this guy, is clearly a league above this. And I forget the exact sequence of events, but around December 2018, I think, Yang actually gets included for the first time ever in a national presidential poll. I got to say, that was like the most exciting moment ever. I mean, we spent all 2018 not getting in polls, getting ignored. And then he shows up in one for Iowa and he gets a 0, but we were like, popping champagne bottles figuratively. And this was around the time where this Facebook group, this was pre-Rogan era, but the Facebook group was pretty active. We had several hundred people in there, but they were super active. I mean, Yang had come in, as I mentioned, December 14th. Yang, of course, quote unquote, made his post, outreach, distribution, and whatever else I said, creation. And so one of the tasks I'd given the group was like, get him listed on here as a major candidate. I mean, it's very small, but this is what you do when, you're a marketer with, nothing really going on. You just really obsessively care about the details, the sub Wikipedia page that 10 people are probably looking at. And there was just this whole battle. I mean, it went on for weeks and weeks because the editors just didn't think he was a major candidate. And, me and my gang of people from Facebook, we were just in there, making arguments because behind the front of the page is there's a whole like editors like forum and they comment back and forth. And it was just like I don't know if, the audience would be familiar with like the term like flame war. I mean, it was just a war of like our supporters trying to make the case and half of them like feigning as if they weren't supporters and they were just like objective researchers. I mean, it was really funny. But obviously once he goes on Joe Rogan and then qualifies for the first debate, only then did it finally break through. I mean, it was a whole thing. They ended up reorganizing the whole page because there was just so much discontent. And there were a lot of people on there who genuinely thought he should be listed as one that weren't Yang people. I mean, it was just a whole fight. Very interesting.
Oh, I know it on a smaller scale. I've tried to just there's a list of politics podcasts on Wikipedia, and I just tried to put mine on there and entered that back forum, and I was just like, hey, you can have it. I don't have an army of, maybe that's what we should do with the Facebook group, lobby for that. But I think we can't discuss the Yang campaign without discussing this math slogan, right? Which is something that you developed and worked very closely with. It was such a sort of iconic figure of expression for that campaign. So can you describe a bit the origins of that and its overall significance to the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a hit. I mean, it's got to be the coolest thing I've probably ever done in my life at this point. What's interesting was in December 2017, we were trying to come up with a slogan for the campaign, and we ended up coming up with Humanity First, and we tested it, and it like did better. We had a bunch of generic things, and the struggle then was like we didn't love Humanity First. We were like, well, it's pretty good. It's what we stand for, basically, and it's sort of original and whatever, but we just never really actually loved it. We were like, okay, well, this is like sort of good enough. That was our sense when we walked away from it and started using it through 2018. But there was always this sort of like, I don't know, ache in our stomachs that was just like, what actually represents us? And through the campaign, I learned a lot about the difficulties of making slogans because it has to so much capture your ethos and it has to be so short and catchy and all sorts of things. So I'll just sort of end that. So it's difficult. And the origin of how it's made was somewhere in 2018, this guy, a friend of Yang's, mentions to him that, he's sort of like the opposite of Donald Trump because he's, an Asian guy that likes math. Yang loves that expression, as anyone who followed him in 2020 heard. I mean, he said it all the time. And crowds went crazy to it. So, I guess go with the data. I personally never really loved it. I didn't think it made sense. I wrote about this somewhere where I was like, I mean, is an Asian guy that likes math really the opposite of Donald Trump? I mean, wouldn't it at least be like Asian woman, maybe a black woman, or I don't know if you get like too specific, like just a a non-humanoid or just an empty space, like vacant of matter? Like, wouldn't that truly be the opposite of Donald Trump? So I don't know. I personally just like never really thought it made logical sense. But whatever, Yang liked it, and so we were recording in 2018 some ads, back when we thought those would do something for us. And he finished one of the ad takes that we made with, that expression, I guess. And as he finished it, an Asian guy likes math. He said math 3 times, like he was chanting. He's like, math, math, math. I like math. And I was behind the camera, and I just had this moment, it's just like one of those things, you can sort of hardly take credit for it because it's just like comes from the subconscious. But I was like, wow, wouldn't it be interesting if we, just printed math on like hats and shirts and signs and stuff. Like, I was like, imagine if we got, we're this big candidate, we had rallies, thousands of people, and people are holding signs that say math. I just thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And Zach Rahman, our campaign manager, was in the room. He loved it. In the moment, he said, print it. It was just one of those things where the moment you hear it, you're just like, oh my God, that's totally it. And when I look back on it, it's like, well, it really was actually his ethos that he was presenting much more than humanity first. He sort of was doing both, but much more of his pitch as a candidate was like, I'm the numbers guy. It's like, I'm the numbers guy. Here's the math. We're going to get UBI. We're going to do all these things. I can pay for it. The data is going to lead us to like, prosperity. It was much more primary than like humanity first. So I think it was like a perfect slogan. Like it was one word. And then also like what I like to say to people is that this was when he had zero credibility and he was unknown and like meant nothing to anybody. Like you heard the name Andrew Yang and you were like, is that a person? Is that a made up human? Like, what is that name? The words together meant nothing to most people. Math was a word that carried meaning. And I thought that was very important because we could use that word that already had an inherent meaning and sort of extract the meaning and impute it into the words Andrew Yang, math. Like everyone who followed in 2020 really knew those sort of like the ethos of those words were combined.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know that, those, once you did print those hats and those signs, they became pretty good sellers, and the merchandise accounted for 25% of the campaign's revenue, which is, much higher than what other campaigns get, maybe with the exception of Donald Trump and the MAGA hats. But I'm curious, we've been talking a lot about these kind of like growing pains and problems with getting the social media accounts started and growing. I'm curious whether that increased in revenue kind of over time led to a professionalization of the campaign, because when you first launched the website, you just copied the flow of some other larger campaigns, assuming that they had tested it so that this should be the optimized strategy, which I think is quite funny. But I remember hearing that also on a podcast that Yang was talking about the universal basic income, that he changed the name to Freedom Dividend because it tests better. And so all of these things kind of lead to at least for me, that the campaign was becoming more professionalized in its messaging. And, you've got the slogan. Now, how are you going to deploy it? So over the course from 2017, 2020, did the campaign itself become more strategic and professionalized?
Yeah. It was a very existential process for us. In 2019, in the fall, we had stalled in the polls. He was at like 3 or 4% for probably 3 or 4 months, which is a long time in, an election cycle. And so we started to ask these sort of like existential questions, like, should we become more of like a traditional candidate? I think the fun and the stunts and the memes and stuff were essential to breaking in. But, that's the sort of whole thing around the product adoption curve, is that you slowly tailor yourself to a larger audience over time. The real question was, I think we'd always expected that the, math and logic and that sort of just like more unconventional approach was going to probably get us farther than 4%. So in the fall, I think we just had this big question of like, what do we do? And there's a lot of sentiment around this idea of like, what got you here won't get you there. But then you also had the counter argument of like, well, Donald Trump didn't change at all. And, from a marketing standpoint, it's like, well, he just rode the same wave from like 0 to 100 nearly into re-election. Ultimately, we chose to go trying to go into the professionalizing angle. And that was like a very interesting experience because it's just very different. Like one thing that happened was we hired some consultants and they made us a new slogan, which was like a new way forward. And in the meeting, they presented it to us. They literally said it meant nothing. Like someone was like, "Hey, that literally is just that's a big platitude." And they were like, "Yeah, it's exactly the point." And it was interesting because they said Yang now had enough meaning behind his name that he could impute those empty words with a meaning. I thought that was interesting because we had used math to pull out meaning, and now he was depositing it into a new slogan. Yeah, and then we tried all the things. We did all the things that we think are going to give you political credibility that the media and traditional political outlets value. You think about the number of offices you have in early states, the number of visits that you have to early states, the total staff size, the amount you're spending on TV ads. Like those are the things that really make the establishment feel like you're taking the campaign seriously, because that's what they think is the only thing that wins. And so it's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where, like, unless you do those things, they don't take you seriously. You can't really win until it's a whole thing. So that's sort of how that went, and then we lost. So it didn't work. But I often wonder if there was really ever like a reality where Yang would have actually won. I mean, just the task of going from total unknown to actually winning. Like my thought has just been like maybe it's too great of a, let's say, an adoption curve to transgress in such a short amount of time. Like you just have to sort of change your identity too much to go from like niche to full mainstream successfully. And so I'm not even sure if it was really ever possible.
Right, which kind of leads well into my next question, which has to do with kind of carrying over that credibility and particularly the audience on social media to a new race. So this week, Andrew Yang unsuccessfully ran for New York City's mayor, but he was a top contender with Eric Adams and a couple others in the race. And I'm curious to get your take on, not just the transformation from niche to mainstream, but when you carry over these large social media accounts that you grew in a presidential campaign, I mean, when you apply that to a more localized race, on the one hand, it's nice to have that name recognition, that more established credibility, but is it always, a positive in the sense that when you're running for a mayoral office, even in a big city like New York, you may want to tailor the content to be focused on New York's policies or what you're planning to do with the city. Whereas you have this large national audience that might not be totally, it's a difference in content between a local policy issue and a kind of national idea or platform. So the question, I guess, is, how do you see walking the line between those two levels of races when you've established a presidential national level audience and then you're running on a more local office like mayor or governor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, mostly from my experience watching Yang, run for mayor, is that everyone who followed him, at least for him, the people who liked him tended to really like him. They didn't mind that content because they went that route where his social media was all about New York. They didn't seem to mind that much, like the Reddit, which is a user generated content community. They were all following it. I mean, with lesser engagement, of course, but they were all following it and very positive about it because I think they just understood that he, was doing what he thought was best and he cared and they cared about him. And so it was received well. It didn't really have too many issues. I think as far as like the strategy of it, at the end of our campaign in 2020, I took over the marketing of our Iowa marketing operation and I learned a lot about local digital politics. And I ultimately came away thinking it like is much less important than in a national campaign, primarily because from what I know about communities online is that people in the 21st century, they organize online by ideology, not so much like region. And so finding, a high density of your people, of your region online is hard. And so ultimately, social media and, stunts and all sorts of things, they take the same amount of effort to do if you're in a local race. Posting 3 times on Instagram is the same amount of effort as it is, for a national versus a local candidate. But your return is much lower because the pockets of people are much smaller and they're harder to identify. And so I ultimately found, if you think about the allocation of resources, you probably get higher returns in some other specific, more targeted things. I think ads and stuff are much higher return in like local races, but that's loosely, I mean, the crossover. I mean, if you watch Yang's social media, for the most, I mean, Twitter, he was up to his own stuff there. But like his Instagram and Facebook, I mean, it was just pictures of him. I mean, it was just like, yay, today we were like hung out with this dog. Like they really didn't utilize it that much. And I don't think that was necessarily the wrong move. The only exclusion to all this, I think, is if your social media and stunts and all those things can be very effective for like a trickle down into your audience, your target audience or group, but only if what you're doing on a national scale is like relevant to them. Like if you think about AOC, whatever she does in DC is like, she's fighting for our district, NY14, and that like excites her audience. So, this last primary she had in 2018, she still won at 75%, even though she didn't have to knock on, 60,000 doors again. And so that's where I think the trickle down works. Like when Yang was in 2020, like I was in Iowa and I was looking at our challenges and I was like, man, it would help right now. Yang doing something awesome nationally and that trickling down, because you're just much less powerless as a digital person, I felt, in a local race to like really break it open. But Yang doing national things while he runs for mayor would look strange. I mean, his tweet about the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, I mean that probably didn't go well for maybe some different reasons, maybe the content of the tweet, but it obviously, like, people in New York, no matter what he said, it was kind of like, why are you even commenting on this? It pretty much has nothing to do with us. So that's my sense on the sort of local digital media politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting to hear all of these different struggles, but also, some of these are specific to outsider campaigns, but I think others are more general to politics. So, Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Absolutely, Michael. Good luck to everyone who's in the trenches. I know politics and social media, it's like the two highest probably stress things you can do.
I've just been speaking with Andrew Frawley, former director of marketing at Gang 2020. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Baroness Beeben Kidron from the organization Five Rights that just launched a campaign entitled Twisted Toys, aimed to highlight the commercial exploitation of children in the digital world and hoping to bring about legislative change to combat that. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melba. See you next time.